thanks so much, Brett. I've had a great time at the symposium. It's my first time. I look forward to future symposia. So Brett pretty much gave a great introduction. So what I'm going to be offering today is a new approach to understanding diet and health, or understanding diet and aging. It's what I call age-dependent patterns of adaptation, and I'm kind of studying this theory in well-replicated populations of Drosophila melanogaster. For those who don't know, that is the lab fruit fly. So yeah, also I am a Ph.D. student. I'm in my last year at UC-Irvine, and a lot of the data in here is what I've accumulated over the last 4 years testing this new hypothesis. So, oh, I can see it here, perfect. Part of my thesis work was really to do sort of a broad review of the diet literature, the diet and aging literature out there. Sort of this search for a diet that optimizes health span or alleviates aging. Health span being just a healthy lifespan, a healthy long lifespan, okay? Not just a long lifespan, but a healthy one, very important, right? So I sometimes use lifespan, health span interchangeably. Really I'm referring to health span. So, and I've come to really categorizing this in two ways, sort of the approaches that are out there. There are the holistic evolutionary-based approaches or theories, and the reductionist-based theories to diet. I think we're all very familiar with the two holistic-based theories that I have here. One being the paleo hypothesis, which I guess in one phrase I could say is that we should see health benefits for those who completely revert to an ancestral or hunter-gatherer diet, one before the advent of agriculture. And then there's an opposing view. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Marlene Zuk. I call this the Zuk hypothesis or the anti-paleo hypothesis, which really takes, again, the opposing view that states that, well, actually diets consisting of organic agricultural foods are best for those provided they have a strong agricultural ancestry. If you haven't read her book, Paleo Fantasy, I recommend it. She sort of outlines this, what I call anti-paleo hypothesis, drawing from examples from crickets all the way up to humans and how evolution is fast, okay? The 10,000 solar years that we've had, that Eurasians have had to adapt to agriculture is plenty of time to see health benefits, to see great benefits on eating those foods. Of course, paleo hypothesis is hasn't been enough time, okay? There's an interesting, actually, exchange in the book Paleo Fantasy between Lauren Cordain and Marlene Zuk, where they argue about how, 10,000 years, that's plenty of time, Marlene says, and of course, Cordain is like, no way. So it's a great book. I recommend that you read that. The more daunting task in my review was sort of looking at the reductionist-based theories, what I call fanning panacea, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, or just finding the fountain of youth, right? This search for a magical compound that's going to extend lifespan and extend health span, whether it be anthocyanins, resveratrol, other polyphenols, and other antioxidants. And then sort of combining these individual successes, despite having lots of failures of replication, into multi-supplements, okay? So there's a whole multi-supplement, a multi-billion-dollar market in multi-supplementation that just really hasn't done very much for our health, in my opinion. Also work by Spindler. He has lots of different studies of different multi-supplements and how they really either are not giving you health benefits or they're actually what I call sort of a poison chalice effect, where you're kind of combining all these things together and you're actually getting negative effects. So all of this searching, for me, I'm sure as well as for you, has really left us very discouraged, right? So what foods do we eat? What foods do we feed our kids? This is obviously an important question, and this is really how I feel when kind of going through these theories. So my approach actually fits its way sort of right in between the paleo hypothesis and the anti-paleo hypothesis. Or really, I should say, circumscribes both, draws from both. Both are wrong and both are right. But before I sort of get into the nitty-gritty of my new approach, it's extremely important that we give a brief review on aging. So what is aging? So aging can be looked at from a molecular biologist standpoint as well as from an evolutionary biologist standpoint. Old ideas, aging as rust. So most of the biogerontology world has agreed that, from scientists, so obviously philosophers Aristotle, Denham Arman, even Aubrey de Grey, have really agreed that aging is some type of just unending process of damage accumulation, akin to rust. This is one of the most popular theories, being the free radical theory of aging, right? Load up on antioxidants. However, these inevitable rust theories are actually refuted by a number of reasons. One of which is that there are organisms that have basic similar mechanisms, cellular mechanisms, that do not age, that don't show any signs of aging. Here's the creosote bush. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the creosote bush. You see this on your way through the Mojave Desert up to Las Vegas, right? But also non-aging organisms such as sea anemones and hydra and flatworms that do not age. But also a very, very important sort of new theory that's been well tested in my lab. There's a book called Does Aging Stop? By my two advisors, Larry Moeller and Michael Rose, and their graduate student, Cassie Rouser, that actually shows great evidence that aging doesn't just continue to increase, it actually stops, okay? I'm not gonna have enough time to really go through what we call late life, but it is one of the reasons why sort of these inevitable rust theories are refuted. So how do evolutionary biologists explain aging? So I guess a good definition from an evolutionary standpoint is that aging can be defined as sort of this sustained age-specific decline in fitness-related traits. Fitness-related traits being fecundity, right, and survivorship. Okay, these are two the most very important fitness traits from a Darwinian standpoint. And this is age-specific decline that's not due to external environmental factors such as predation or disease. So for those of you who sort of understand Darwinian theory and sort of have an idea of aging, there's sort of a paradox, right? There's a paradox that arises from sort of this conflict between aging and Darwin's theory of natural selection. So if natural selection designs organisms for optimal survival and optimal reproductive success, right, Darwinian fitness, then why doesn't evolution prevent aging in the first place? So scientists such as J.B.S. Haldane, Ronald Fisher, Peter Medawar in the early 1950s with mutation accumulation hypothesis, and George Williams in the late 1950s with antagonistic pleiotropy, have all sort of kind of converged on sort of a simple premise for why aging occurs. I call these Hamilton's forces of natural selection. They've been coined Hamiltons just because William Hamilton wrote a 1966 paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology called Molding the Theory of Senescence, where he mathematically actually formalized these forces that I have here. The math is extremely complicated, and don't have enough time to go through it with you, but I will go over the simple premise. So here we have the forces of natural selection. The level of the force is on the y-axis, and that's as a function of age. So how many of you have actually seen this curve before? Okay, great. So I will explain it. So here we have some parameters down below. Whoops, hit the wrong button. So prior to the first age of reproduction in a population, which I call this little b parameter, the forces of natural selection are strong. After the first stage of reproduction, these forces begin to attenuate. It's the attenuation in these forces that actually lead to the evolution of aging. These forces decline and converge upon zero, which is where we see the evolution of the late life phase. There's sort of there actually are four distinct phases in the life history of an organism. Pre-aging phase, the aging phase followed by late life, and then there's actually a fourth phase called death spiral that I won't be talking about. So these forces of natural selection sort of provide scaling or weighting factors for selection's impact on each of the various age-specific components in an organism's life history, be it a fruit fly, a sexually reproducing metazoan like a fruit fly, or a human. Forces of natural selection are strong at early ages and attenuate. So let me go back. So if, in fact, it's the forces of natural selection that are sort of responsible for the evolution of aging, we should actually be able to manipulate these parameters to change, to dramatically change the aging patterns in an organism. Of course, doing this in humans would be unethical, right? Doing this in fruit flies is quite easy. So that's actually what my advisor, Michael Rose, has been doing since the 1970s. Changing the forces of natural selection can produce rapid evolution aging patterns. So I'm sure not many of you are familiar with the life history of a fruit fly, so we'll go over it here. It's quite simple. Fruit flies start off as eggs. They hatch into larvae. They pupate similar to a butterfly, a caterpillar and a butterfly, and then they eclose from pupa to a young adult. So in this normal breeding regime, we collect eggs for the next generation only in a particular reproductive window. So eggs prior to that window are discarded, eggs after that window are discarded. Okay? So we call on only a certain age individual to lay eggs. What do I mean by call on? We actually just stick a plate in their cage, collect eggs, and those are the eggs we use for the next generation. Okay? So that is the normal breeding regime for what we call actually our bee line fruit flies. So how about shifting this little b parameter to the right? We can do this pretty easily, right? We can manipulate this pretty easily with populations of fruit flies. And that's exactly what my advisor has been doing, and I've been doing for the last 4 years. Same process, right? But instead of calling on young adults, collecting eggs from young adults, we collect eggs only from aging reproductive adults. So all eggs prior are discarded, and then we only take eggs from, again, a certain reproductive window from aging reproductive adults. And so we see rapid phenotypic divergence in survivorship, simply only after 50 generations. This data is actually a little longer, but again, rapid phenotypic divergence. This is mortality rates as a function of biological age. You can see in the blue and the red lines, this is a log graph. I don't know if you guys are familiar with reading log graphs, but essentially higher up or a lower negative value is going to be higher mortality rates. So in blue and red, we see populations sort of right off the bat aging and moving into late life. And then we see sort of with these delayed reproductive regime flies in orange and green, we have this pre-aging phase, this amazing pre-aging phase, followed by pretty cool right after their first stage of reproduction, day 28, following by an aging phase and a late life phase. So overall, there is a huge difference in lifespan between, a very statistically significant difference in lifespan between these organisms. And this is data from a paper we actually just published a week ago. All right, so all that's great, right? But the process would be very long for humans to make us age longer, right? Calling on older individuals, only allowing older humans to reproduce. But so how can we actually change human aging without genetic evolution? Okay, well, the punchline is eat the right foods, okay? Eat the right diet. And I will show you sort of this new Hamiltonian approach with the forces of natural selection in mind. So this graph can be kind of confusing, but I'll walk through it slowly. Here we have a phenotypic value on the y-axis. We have age on the x-axis. So we're going to take a population, let's say fruit flies, since those are my favorite model organisms. So we're going to take a population of fruit flies that are consuming a particular diet. We'll call this the ancestral diet for, let's say, thousands and thousands of generations. Okay? We would expect them, or I should say phenotypic optimum for the purposes of this lecture, we can consider it health span, let's say, right? So we would expect populations in this long ancestral environment to perform along this red line that I'm highlighting here, over age. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this population and we're going to move it to a new environment. And a new environment that's a novel environment, of course, and this new environment is going to have a new optimum. This optimum is along this blue line here. I don't want you to think of this line as being higher or lower. I could totally switch these and the same premise would exist. So of course, after transferring them to this new environment, we'll let selection take its course. We'll adapt these populations to their new environment. Now, with the forces of natural selection and the decline in these forces, we would expect fast transition from this ancestral phenotype to the new phenotype. Okay, obviously, first, when you put this new population in a new environment, they're going to perform pretty crappy, if you will, right? But after more and more generations, we're going to expect, with these forces of natural selection and their decline, we're going to expect a rapid push to this new phenotype, this new optimum, but then a slower push at later ages. In other words, populations at early ages are going to resemble that of this new phenotype, leaving later aged individuals resembling that of the ancestral phenotype. So this was kind of a cool idea based on well-tested theory, but I actually, of course, would like to model this. So I actually called on one of my colleagues, Kevin Fung, who is a modeler, he's a theoretician, and he actually modeled this concept. So here's a mathematical simulation of adaptation as a function of age. So it's the same setup as the previous slide. We have an optimum in this ancestral environment and an optimum in this new environment. So after more and more generations of moving a population from this ancestral environment to this new environment, we would expect a rapid push at early ages, followed sort of by an attenuation and a convergence back to the ancestral sort of phenotype at later ages. And so after more and more generations of selection, we sort of see this further push, fast at early ages, not so fast at later ages. So again, this is an actual model. And again, the math is a little complicated. If you're interested in, if you have questions on the actual model, I do have slides after that I can show you. So here's a review. So adaptation to novel environments are going to depend on biological age. So later ages are going to respond slower to selection in the new environment. So natural selection will first favor adaptation after this environmental change at younger ages, leaving older individuals best adapted to their long ancestral environment, not their new environment. So coming in as an undergrad into Michael Rose's lab, we thought it would be so cool to actually test this in our fruit flies because we can do it. So how can we do this? Well, we actually have populations of fruit flies that have a known dietary history. Okay, similar to us, they have an ancestral diet, a recent or agricultural diet, and then we can play around with novel diets. So we can begin testing, we can begin experimentally testing this hypothesis by exposing our replicated populations to novel, recent, and long-standing diets. And so what are we going to monitor? Well, we're going to monitor age-specific parameters, fecundity, and mortality. Sort of in terms of Darwinian fitness, everything else is subservient, right? So here's just a review of actually the populations we used. We used populations under the normal breeding regime. I've already explained this to you, right? In a little bit of a different way, we have egg to pupa phase. Here's day 1 from egg to pupa in this screened region. They hatch, and then we put them into cages, and then we actually collect eggs between day 9 and day 10. So if you want to picture this in terms of the forces of natural selection begin to decline at day 9, much earlier than the older breeding regime flies. So here's the dietary history of our fruit flies. So their long-standing diet is actually feeding on rotten apples. Okay, so it was in 1981 that we transferred, we actually sampled these flies from these very large apple orchards for evolutionary domestication to move them into the lab, where we started feeding them banana molasses medium. Okay, banana molasses medium is just essentially banana, agar, and lots of yummy high fructose corn syrups, caro syrups, and barley malt. And since then, for our faster breeding regime, it's been about 1,000 generations that they've been consuming this diet. And so what do we monitor? Again, lots of math here. But we monitored what's called PXMX. PX being conditional survival probability. Essentially, it's just the probability of living from one age to the next. as well as eggs per surviving female. Eggs per surviving female, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's on average, because we did this on a population basis, not on an individual basis. So it's the average age, the average number of eggs laid by an average female. And then we multiply these two parameters. This gives us a great idea of age-specific functional health. The process was extremely grueling, okay? So we're talking about thousands and thousands of fruit flies that we had to care for, that we had to sex, that we had to count eggs. Overall, I think I've counted, not myself, but my students have counted about over 20 million eggs in these experiments, okay? Thousands and thousands of populations, or thousands and thousands of individuals. So very, very large experiments by any standard. And this is actually how we collected eggs. We put them out onto a filter paper, and then we scanned them and counted them with a very cool algorithm. Okay, so let's look at hypothetical PXMX trends. So what are we going to expect when we expose our populations to varying diets? Okay, with Hamiltonian theory in mind. So first, I want to draw your attention to this red and blue line. So at early ages, we would expect populations to perform significantly better or as well on a recent diet compared to their long-standing diet. However, at later ages, we would expect to see a more rapid decrease in PXMX over time compared to this ancestral diet. Okay, now let's draw your attention to the red line and the orange line. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. Take a fly that's from an ancestral environment, move it to a novel environment, they're going to, again, perform pretty crappy in terms of PXMX, right? In comparison to from the blue line to the orange line, we would expect with the strong force of natural selection at early ages, populations performing pretty well on this banana diet compared to this novel diet. However, we would expect potentially some convergence at later ages. The 1,000 or so generations just hasn't been enough time to sort of adapt these populations to this environment, so they would perform maybe similar to a novel diet. So these were predictions that were a priori before I actually collected my data. And so let's first start with moving our fruit flies that have been exposed to this banana diet for roughly 1,000 generations, this banana molasses diet, and we're going to move them to a novel diet. Okay, what I chose, we actually looked at a lot of different diets, a lot of different novel diets. I can't show you the data from all of them, but the trend is the same, actually. So we picked an orange diet. We don't expect populations to have much adaptation to orange, the orangey citric acid, if you will, and other compounds in the orange. And this is the data. So I'm not fond of just drawing trend lines. I'm sorry, I'm not fond of just drawing averages. And so what I did here for you guys is I plotted all replicates. Okay, so we have PXMX as a function of age. In orange is the performance on PXMX on the orange diet, blue being on the banana diet, the recent diet. Each of these points is essentially the PXMX of that replicate at that particular age. So we should have 5 blue circles and 5 blue, 5 orange squares. And so I did some statistical analysis on this. I actually used a 3-parameter, 2-stage linear regression to look at this. In this first sort of stage, which I have here, we see a statistically significant difference between the orange and the banana flies, with orange performing significantly worse on this diet, with a p-value of 0.000. Break age, not so important for us today. What is important is this second stage slope. It's the rate of decline in PXMX over time. So we don't see really any difference in this sort of slope, this decline in these later ages. So now what we did, so let's just sort of review what we just went over. Younger flies performed significantly better on the evolutionary recent diet compared to the evolutionary novel diet. However, we didn't see that same trend in older flies, right? Flies didn't perform significantly better on this at later ages on the evolutionary recent diet compared to the novel diet. And for time, I'm going to skip the next point. So results seem to conform to our Hamiltonian predictions. So now here comes the fun part. assaying flies on a relatively recent diet compared to an ancestral diet. This was an assay with 36,000 individuals and 4 million eggs counted. Lots of undergrads to help us out with this. And here are the results. Once again, same setup. Actually, we did 2 experiments, so you actually see 10 points per treatment. We don't see much difference in this early stage, p-value of 0.630, it's early stage intercept. But the cool thing here is look at later ages, right? We see a significantly greater decrease in PXMX on this banana diet compared to the ancestral diet at later ages. So younger adult flies fared well on the evolutionary recent diet, while older flies fared better on the medium that is relatively similar to their evolutionary ancestral apple diet. I forgot to mention this evolutionary ancestral diet obviously couldn't be perfectly emulated, right? So it's just rotting applesauce and some yeast. That's what it is. So with the decline in the forces of natural selection, the 1,000 or so generations of adaptation to that banana sugary high fructose diet is too little time to adapt that population's essential metabolic and physiological processes at those later ages. So again, our experimental results appear to conform to Hamiltonian predictions. How much time do I have left? Sorry. 3 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to actually skip this for time. But so the conclusions that I have here is we provided evidence for showing that age-specific adaptation to a novel environment proceeds at different rates. This is this age specificity that I was talking about. For genetic variants affecting early life phenotypes versus late life phenotypes. And we did this, of course, in well-replicated experiments. So what do these findings suggest? I can only make a suggestion, right? We simply just tested this hypothesis. Well, my suggestion would be that findings that humans could revert to an ancestral diet at later ages to alleviate a lot of these age-related disorders. However, at early ages, long agricultural human populations might be best able to achieve reasonable health on their agricultural diet, depending on their ancestry. Okay, so for Eurasians, the transition is probably around your, what we've sort of determined is the sort of 30s to 40 range. That's when your transition should be made. Thank you very much. So if you're interested in some of these review articles that I've posted, that I published, please visit my website, as well as my advisor's website, 55 Theses, which sort of explains everything in great detail.
There's 10 minutes of Q&A too.
Perfect.
So you can go back to some of the slides if you like.
Oh, great. Awesome. I wasn't sure about that, because I thought it was a strict deadline there. So, okay, maybe I'll go back, depending on the questions. Hi.
So you just proved a theory of mine that at these conferences, all the paleo skeptics are young, and all the paleo believers are older. And I found that to be true in speakers. Now I know why.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
But
yeah.
why do you, if you put a fly on a novel diet that they at a young age, they do much better during their reproductive years? What's the mechanism there?
So why do they do better?
Yeah.
They don't do better on that novel diet. Compared to what? In comparison
Well,
to...
you know, during their reproductive years,
yes,
they seem to be at a higher level on this new diet.
Novel versus recent?
Right.
So they actually perform poorly on this novel diet in orange.
Even at a young age?
Even at a young age.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
That was a great, really interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Can you, you skipped a slide at
Yes.
the end that was talking about delaying reproduction. And so
Okay.
I guess my question, or I just want to know more about that, but my question is then, how do we, we as a species, we're not supposed to reproduce at age 45, 50. So if we're thinking about how we could delay reproduction to sort of benefit populations, how will that work in
How would
humans?
that work? It would
Yeah,
have to
because
be.
you
It would
can't-
have to be very widespread. We're an outbred species, so this have to be worldwide. We have to delay our reproduction worldwide.
But physically, after age 40, reproduction declines.
Reproduction does decline. Also, reproduction declines on our fruit flies, but we can still do these selection experiments to actually create longer-lived organisms.
Maybe you can go back to that slide and
Sure.
we can review that.
In other words, you're using reproduction as a proxy for health, but
Yes.
that would be just
I'm using it, yes, I'm using reproduction as a proxy for health in fruit flies, yes. So I'm using essentially what's health span, both reproduction and survivorship.
So delaying reproduction in humans. Let's convert to humans for a second.
Okay.
Delaying reproduction in humans, that generation should technically live longer.
No.
No.
No, this is, evolution has a process, right? It's over
Okay.
a number, I mean, we're talking, in our fruit flies, we're talking, hundreds of generations here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I will go into some more detail on sort of this process of doing these same diet experiments in our longer lived flies. And that started here. So again, here are our shorter lived flies under our normal breeding regime, right? And our longer lived flies. I showed you some mortality graphs to show you differences in lifespan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if we were to use these older lived flies and tested them? They have the same diet history, right? Fewer generations, however, on this recent diet, just because it's a longer life history, right? Okay. So we would expect, actually, with the force of natural selection, that little b parameter pushing it off to the right to further ages, the force of natural selection can actually do its thing into later adult ages, stronger selection, and so this is actually what we would expect a transitional phenotype to look like in our longer lived fruit flies. A further push into later ages, basically would be, so if you look at, so we would see this is the transitional phenotype for our normal breeding regime. Our later breeding regime, we would expect more extensive adaptation into later ages, just simply by pushing that reproductive age to later ages after generations of selection. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and so this is actually the data we see. Okay, so here we actually see more extensive adaptation at early ages, but then a decline. And actually, I've done some preliminary statistical analysis on this, and I don't see much of a difference at all. There is an outlier that's sort of pushing this banana population up, but there really isn't any statistical significant differences between the apple diet and the banana diet around day 30. Of course, this is hot off the press right here, actually. So I just thought I'd fit it in.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one question,
Yeah.
one comment. First of all, you may have said this, but how did you measure the performance of the fruit flies?
Functional health, yeah, I've measured it by looking at their health span. looking at their survivorship and their fecundity.
What is that second word?
I'm so sorry. Okay, fecundity is just simply eggs. It's the amount of eggs they produce.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, comment, from a practical standpoint in
Yeah.
humans, it seems like, starting off with an agricultural diet and
Yeah.
switching to an ancestral diet at age 40 or whatever it's kind of impractical, or to me, it seems like it would be easier to just, eat one diet your entire life.
Well, my data is actually suggest that. Take a look at this. Right? So you can get great health benefits with both at early ages. So why not be paleo?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's much more practical. Sure. Also, you have to remember, this is a strict transition. This
Yeah.
was moving flies from one environment to a new environment. They only consumed banana molasses food, right? That's not like us. So
Yeah.
so you have to kind of keep that in mind when looking at this.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I guess I had a similar question. Thanks for your nice presentation.
Thank you.
I think it has already been answered, but what I wanted to ask is whether these data show that there should be no advantages expected from a paleo diet for example, young child diseases like autism or
So you,
gastrointestinal disorders. But I think you already said that, well, I don't know.
right, I would I would sort of contend that actually you could see benefits for young kids on both types of diet, both diets, provided, keyword here, organic agricultural foods, okay? Not the crappy industrial diet that we consume, okay?
Okay, so your data actually do not apply to, let's say, a Western diet versus a paleo diet.
No, Western diet, nor an organic. I mean, of course, 10,000 years ago, the advent of agriculture is not what agricultural foods are now, right? We have processing. I mean, it's pretty much an industrial type diet. It really takes into it really is this diet, right? It's a novel diet.
Yeah, and they perform worse on the novel
Yes,
diet. Yeah,
exactly.
okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm starting to get the point. Thanks.
Okay.
It's interesting on your other graph where they did about the same.
Yeah.
These flies obviously have no choice in their diet.
No,
And so
exactly.
a factor that would have to come in with humans is that taste preferences are developed even apparently prior to birth, and then certainly very early in life. And if a human, even if a human could say do well up into a certain age, there might be a great disadvantage in that most humans then would not be able to make the shift since their taste preferences had already developed.
Very
over
good
the
point.
course of-
Yeah. I know in my case, I did move to a paleo diet, and it was hell. It was hell, like no joke. I mean, it was miserable for like 3 months. I mean, and then unfortunately, I've sort of gone back.
I'll just comment. This was an
Yeah.
astonishing amount of data. Congratulations on
Yes, thank you.
how much
Thank you.
you've done.
A lot of big journals don't think so, but yeah, no, it was a lot of work, and that really doesn't go to me. That really goes to the undergraduates at UC-Irvine. They were absolutely amazing. Our lab has about 250 enrolled undergraduates in our 199 independent study course. So, yeah. Hey, Brett.
Yeah, so it's the way to translate this into like plain language, I'm
Yeah.
guessing, is that the very first genes to have evolved
Yes.
after the Neolithic transition would have protected us just until we got old enough to reproduce. After which case, evolution, in a sense, doesn't care about us as much. That's
Right.
that's how aging works anyway. But it's like
Right.
it like sort of accelerates that, or kind of it makes it more acute, right? And then. Is that right?
That is right. So I didn't go into things like mutation accumulation, hypothesis, and antagonistic pleiotropy. It's somewhat complicated, but in terms of antagonistic pleiotropy by George C. Williams, is really that sort of beneficial effects in early in life, alleles that have beneficial effects early in life, despite having antagonistic pleiotropic negative effects at later in life, would still be selected for, right? Because there's this selection shadow. So I think that's sort of what you're sort of getting at.
Yeah, the selection shadow. Like the force of natural selection is all up at its maximum until the age at which the organism can get some reproduction done,
Right.
And then it starts to drop off.
Right.
So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And who Marlene Zook studied under Hamilton?
Yeah, so it's actually funny. Marlene Zook's advisor, I think she's at Minnesota now. She was at Riverside. I'm not sure where she did her PhD, but was William Hamilton actually. And Hamilton was more involved with kin selection. I don't know if you guys are familiar with kin selection, but this was actually not a very famous paper at the time. I considered it a landmark paper, and it is really a landmark paper now. Yeah, so Marlene should look into this.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So yeah.
okay.
So
All right.
one more
Yeah,
quick.
yeah.
If like so, one implication is this, that populations whose recent ancestors have not been exposed to the Neolithic foodstuffs,
Yes.
you would expect them to not even have the benefit of those novel genes that would have arisen.
No.
So they're
No benefit. Nope.
so they're doubly.
So yeah, so
Yeah,
no,
vulnerable.
they should be consuming a Paleolithic diet, their version of a Paleolithic diet, depending on where they're from, depending on their ancestry, right? And I think we talked a lot about that with the Inuits. Yeah, so thank you. We can talk though if you want. I do have to run though. My flight leaves at 5:50, but we can talk. Thank you very much.